Imagine being a child, taken not to play, but to watch someone die. For centuries, societies did not hide death from the young. They displayed it, publicly, deliberately, and repeatedly. This is the history of when death became education and entertainment for children. Chapter 1. A world without childhood innocence. For most of human history, the idea of childhood innocence did not exist as it does today. In ancient, medieval, and early modern societies, childhood was brief, fragile, and often brutal. Nearly half of all children born before the 18th century died before reaching adulthood. Disease, famine, and violence were not distant threats, they were daily realities, visible in every household and in every street. Children were not shielded from death because there was no practical way to do so. To do so, bodies were prepared at home. Executions took place in public squares. Animals were slaughtered openly. Warfare passed directly through towns and villages. From an early age, children saw the same world adults did, because survival depended on early exposure, not emotional protection. Historical records from Europe, the Middle East, and Asia consistently showed children accompanying parents to markets, courts, and punishment grounds. This was not considered cruelty. It was considered education. Death was viewed as a moral instructor, a warning against disobedience, crime, or defiance of authority. Fear was not hidden from the young, it was deliberately shown. Philosophers and religious leaders reinforced this mindset. Medieval Christian doctrine emphasized death as divine judgment. In Confucian societies, public punishment reinforced social order and obedience. Across cultures, exposure to mortality was believed to harden children for adulthood, discipline their behavior, and prepare them for lives defined by hardship. In a world where survival was uncertain, innocence was not preserved. It was surrendered early, in full view of the scaffold, the battlefield, and the grave. Chapter 2. Public executions as civic spectacle. Across much of recorded history, executions were not hidden acts of justice. They were public events, staged deliberately in the most visible spaces of society. Town squares, city gates, and marketplaces became theaters of punishment, where law was enforced not only through death, but through display. Attendance was expected, not discouraged, and that expectation included children. In medieval Europe, executions were often scheduled on market days to ensure large crowds. Court records and eyewitness accounts from cities like Paris, London, and Nuremberg describe entire families present at hangings, beheadings, and burnings. Children stood beside parents as criminals, heretics, and traitors were punished. This was not viewed as entertainment in the modern sense, but as civic instruction. The body of the condemned served as a warning made visible. Similar practices existed far beyond Europe. In Ming and Qing dynasty China, public executions, especially beheadings, were conducted in designated execution grounds, with crowds watching in silence. In Tokugawa Japan, criminals were executed publicly at places like Kazukapara in Edo, where spectators, including children, observed the consequences of violating social order. In the Roman Republic and Empire, executions of traitors and slaves were carried out before assembled citizens to reinforce state authority. Rulers understood the power of spectacle. Public death communicated obedience, hierarchy, and fear more effectively than written law. Children were present because they were future subjects. By witnessing punishment early, they learned where power resided and what defiance cost. To these societies, shielding the young from executions would have weakened the lesson. Justice was not private, it was meant to be seen, remembered, and absorbed, generation after generation. Chapter 3. Rome's arena, training the young through blood. In ancient Rome, violence was not only tolerated in public life, it was cultivated. Nowhere was this more visible than in the amphitheaters, where gladiatorial games functioned as state-sponsored spectacle and political messaging. From the late Republic through the height of the Empire, these games were among the most attended public events in Roman society, and children were present in large numbers. Roman writers, including Juvenal and Seneca, describe crowds that included men, women, and the young. Attendance was not restricted by age. Children accompanied parents to the Colosseum and provincial arenas, absorbing a constructed display of power, hierarchy, and death. Gladiators, often enslaved men, prisoners of war, or condemned criminals, fought and died to demonstrate Roman dominance over both bodies and fate. This exposure was consistent with Roman values. Roman education emphasized virtus, courage, endurance, and obedience to the state. Military service was central to citizenship, and violence was understood as a necessary tool of order. Watching men face death without flinching was considered formative, especially for boys destined for military life. Material evidence reinforces this normalization. Archaeologists have uncovered children's toys shaped like gladiators, oil lamps with scenes from the arena, and graffiti scratched by young hands naming favorite fighters. School exercises referenced famous combats. Far from being hidden, the violence of the games entered domestic life and early education. The arena taught lessons no classroom could. It showed who held power, whose lives were expendable, and how Rome enforced control. For Roman children, death in the amphitheater was not shocking. It was familiar, a spectacle designed to shape loyalty, masculinity, and obedience from the earliest possible age. Chapter 4. Medieval Europe, Death as a Lesson. In medieval Europe, death was not confined to battlefields or distant courts. It stood openly in the center of town life. Gallows were permanent structures, often erected near city gates or marketplaces, where the bodies of the executed were left on display for days. Beheadings, hangings, and burnings were conducted before assembled crowds, and children were routinely among them. Legal and religious authorities framed these executions as moral instruction. Crime was not simply punished. It was performed. Heretics were burned to demonstrate the fate of those who defied church doctrine. Traitors were drawn and quartered to show the consequences of disloyalty to the crown. Criminals were executed publicly to reinforce obedience to law. Parents brought children because witnessing justice was considered part of their education. Church teachings reinforced this exposure. Sermons emphasized divine judgment, sin, and eternal punishment. Death on the scaffold mirrored death in the afterlife. Schools operated by monasteries and cathedrals taught these ideas alongside scripture, normalizing the presence of violence as part of God's order. Fear was not seen as harmful, it was seen as corrective. Execution days became communal events. Vendors sold food, crowds gathered early. Chroniclers from England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire describe executions drawing thousands, including families. Children watched as bodies fell, flames rose, and authority was asserted through force. In this world, death was not hidden to preserve innocence, it was displayed to shape behavior. Medieval society believed that seeing punishment early would guide children toward obedience, faith, and submission to both earthly and divine power. Chapter 5. Festivals of Death, when killing became celebration. In many societies, death was not only public, it was woven into celebration. Executions, animal killings, and ritual sacrifice were often timed to coincide with festivals, religious holidays, or royal events. These occasions blurred the line between punishment, tradition, and entertainment, and children were active witnesses within them. In medieval and early modern Europe, executions were frequently scheduled on feast days, when crowds were already gathered. Bull baiting, bear baiting, and public animal killings were common forms of sanctioned entertainment. Children watched animals torn apart in town squares, learning to associate violence with communal pleasure and ritual observance. In Spain, public bull spectacles evolved into formalized events, attended by all ages. Long before modern age restrictions existed, ritual killing was not limited to Europe. In parts of Mesoamerica, including the Aztec Empire, human sacrifice occurred during major religious festivals. Children were present as observers, and in some rituals, children themselves were selected for sacrifice, believed to hold special spiritual significance. These acts were not viewed as cruelty, but as necessary offerings to sustain cosmic order. Repetition played a crucial role. When killing occurred predictably, on holidays, anniversaries, or state occasions, it lost its shock. Violence became familiar, even anticipated. Over generations, exposure hardened communities to suffering and normalized death as a social event rather than a tragedy. For children raised in these environments, celebration and killing were not opposites. They were intertwined. Festivals taught not joy alone, but hierarchy, obedience, and the acceptance of death as a collective experience, one sanctioned, organized, and remembered by the entire community. Chapter 6. War Zones in Child Spectators. For much of history, war was not distant from civilian life. Battles, sieges, and massacres unfolded directly within cities and villages, placing children at the center of violence rather than safely beyond it. In these environments, death was not an event, it constant presence. During medieval and early modern sieges, entire populations were trapped behind walls for months or years. Children witnessed starvation, disease, and executions carried out by occupying forces or defending authorities. When cities fell, prisoners were often executed publicly as warnings. Chroniclers of the Crusades, the 30 Years' War, and the Mongol invasions record mass killings conducted in full view of civilian populations, including children. Public execution of enemy soldiers served a strategic purpose. It demonstrated dominance and discouraged rebellion. Children growing up in these conditions learned early who held power and what resistance cost. Violence became a language of authority, reinforced daily through sight and experience. Historical diaries and letters reveal how normalized this exposure became. Accounts from 17th-century Europe describe children watching hangings of deserters or collaborators as routine occurrences. In war-torn regions, death was absorbed into daily life alongside work, prayer, and survival. This constant exposure shaped behavior and identity. Children learned loyalty through fear, hatred through loss, and obedience through observation. Psychological distance from death was impossible when violence surrounded every aspect of life. In war zones, childhood did not end with a single traumatic event. It eroded gradually, as repeated exposure to death transformed the extraordinary into the ordinary, leaving generations conditioned to accept violence as an unavoidable condition of existence. Chapter 7. Colonial Violence and Moral Instruction. During the Age of Empire, public violence became a deliberate tool of control. European colonial powers used executions, floggings, and mutilations not only to punish resistance, but to educate subject populations through fear. These punishments were carried out publicly, and indigenous children were often forced to watch. In British India, public hangings follow uprisings such as the Indian Rebellion of 1857. Rebels were executed in town centers, sometimes tied to cannons, a method intended to terrorize witnesses. Colonial records describe crowds assembled deliberately, ensuring the lesson reached every generation. Similar practices occurred in French Algeria, Dutch-controlled Indonesia, and the Belgian Congo, where corporal punishment and executions were carried out before local communities. Colonial authorities justified these actions as necessary discipline. Violence was framed as a civilizing force, meant to impose order, obedience, and moral correction. Missionary schools and colonial education systems reinforced this logic, teaching children that punishment reflected moral failure rather than domination. Exposure to executions was presented as instruction in law and authority. Children absorbed these lessons early. Witnessing the humiliation or death of elders reshaped their understanding of power, justice, and survival. Resistance became associated with public suffering, obedience with safety. These experiences left deep psychological and cultural scars, transmitted across generations. Through memory and silence, colonial violence did not simply punish the present. It targeted the future. By making children witnesses to brutality, empires attempted to shape compliant subjects before they reached adulthood. Death became a lesson, carefully staged, publicly delivered, and enforced through fear rather than consent. Chapter 8. The Shift. When society began to look away. By the late 18th century, a profound transformation began to take place in how societies understood both punishment and childhood. Enlightenment. Thinkers questioned whether public violence truly educated or merely brutalized. Philosophers such as John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau argued that children were not miniature adults, but psychologically distinct beings shaped by early experience. Exposure to cruelty, they warned, did not produce virtue, it produced harm. At the same time, states began to reconsider the Purpose of punishment. Public executions increasingly drew criticism for turning justice into spectacle. Crowds were unruly, sympathy sometimes shifted toward the condemned, and violence no longer reliably reinforced authority. In England, public hangings were increasingly seen as corrupting rather than instructive. Similar debates unfolded across France, Germany, and parts of the United States. The response was structural. Prisons replaced scaffolds, punishment moved indoors, away from public view. In France, executions remained public after the Revolution, but by the mid-19th century, attendance, especially by children, was widely condemned. Britain carried out its last public execution in 1868. Other European states followed. This shift coincided with rising literacy, compulsory schooling, and new ideas about child development. Childhood became a protected stage of life, defined by moral guidance rather than fear. Witnessing death was no longer considered educational, it was considered dangerous. The disappearance of public executions marked more than legal reform. It reflected a deeper moral change, the belief that societies shape themselves by what they choose to hide, not just by what they display, especially to their children. Chapter 9. The legacy we still carry. The disappearance of public executions did not erase humanity's fascination with death, it transformed it. What was once staged in town squares moved into newspapers, photographs, films, and eventually digital media. The spectacle survived, reshaped for new audiences and new technologies, often reaching children in subtler but equally persistent ways. 19th century illustrated broadsheets depicted executions in detail, widely circulated and accessible to young readers. In the 20th century, cinema and television brought violence into the home, framing it as drama, heroism, or entertainment. Today, historical reenactments, video games, and online content continue this lineage, presenting death at a distance yet with constant visibility. History reveals a consistent pattern. Societies do not abandon spectacle, they regulate it. Where once children stood at the foot of the scaffold, they now encounter violence through screens, stories, and simulations. The methods have changed, but the underlying curiosity remains rooted in the same human impulses, fear, control, and the desire to understand mortality. Understanding this past matters because it challenges the belief that exposure to death is a modern problem. It is not, it is an ancient one, shaped by culture, power, and necessity. What has changed is not humanity's relationship with death, but how carefully it is framed. Every society chooses what it shows its children. History makes one truth clear: those choices leave marks that last far longer than the spectacle itself. History is not only preserved in monuments and dates, it survives in what societies choose to show and hide from their children. If you value history told without myths, without fiction, and without comfort, only real events, real consequences, and real human behavior, then this channel exists for you. Subscribe to continue exploring the darker truths history rarely explains, but never forgets.